What's up, gamers? Welcome back to another After Action Report. My name is Joshua Joshi Howard, and today we're going to be talking about the event that I went to this last weekend called OC5's the 40K GT by Dicehammer. This was a 5-man teams event hosted down in Irvine, California by Dicehammer. If you remember the fact that I went to an event a month or two ago called California Team Championships, or CTC. This is hosted by the same guys, so big shout out to Nick, big shout out to Dicehammer and Irvine Lanes for hosting this event. I went to this same event last year with a different roster and we won that, so going back to this time again ends up being a lot of fun. So to start off with, I was not originally planning to go to this event. This was an event that, I had just gone down to California for CTC. I had just had an opportunity to play with what a lot of people think in my club is kind of like the A team, so some of the strongest players from Githammer in order to bring to an event. This one was not really one I was planning on going to, but then one of the teams that was going was like, hey, what if we end up flying you down to this event? And I was like, okay, well, sure, in that case, if I don't have to pay for the flight, if I don't have to pay for housing because I can stay at somebody's house, yeah, I'll go. If I just have to pay for food, make sure I can get everything else taken care of while I'm there, we can go ahead and make that happen. With that in mind, though, this was not the most serious of events for me. What ended up happening was a lot of the members of Githammer that wanted to be on this team banded together very quickly, and it ended up being like a pretty strong roster of the people within Githammer. And then they asked me to come down, and then we also asked our friend Jason McKenzie, who plays with Xeno's Petting Zoo, because XPZ did not have a roster going to this event. It's like, hey, Jason, would you like to come play with us? And so it very quickly becomes a team that goes from being a pretty decent team to like, wow, suddenly there are 2 members of Team USA playing for this team. And this event was kind of funny because on the one hand, there was a bit that we were doing, but we also kind of took it seriously, but kind of didn't. It was kind of in a weird spot, but it ended up being a lot of fun. So firstly, we called ourselves Githammer Presents the Omars Gonzalez. The guy who bought the ticket and ended up putting this roster together was named Omar, and we had the idea of doing something like this for a while. I actually, right before recording this video, changed my name in the event because I was also one of the Omars Gonzalez. This led to a couple of funny things happening. The first one was that people in the community didn't really know who was on this roster kind of until we showed up. The fact that I was coming down, the fact that we had Jason McKenzie playing for us as well, ended up taking a couple of people by surprise, especially because of how strong the roster ended up being relative to a lot of the rest of the field. The other thing is that a couple of other teams started playing along with it. We not only had Githammer Presents the Omars Gonzalez, but we also had Githammer Presents the Victor's Campos. And then the team that had the TO playing with it, Dicehammer, changed their name to Out with the Omar, In with the Victor. And then another one of the judges thought this was so funny and really started playing into it that we changed every single team's name to somehow include Omar in it at some point. We had fake mustaches. It was a good time. The other big thing about this event that I do want to bring up is the fact that normally for a lot of these teams events, a lot of teams that I end up playing with are ones that I am the captain for. They're the ones that I'm going to be doing pairings for. I'm going to have a lot of focus on making sure they have a matrix and all that kind of stuff. This was not that kind of event for me. I really just wanted to show up and get games in so that I could get a lot more comfortability with Recon while I get ready for an event that I'm trying a little bit harder for, the Wyoming Team Championship. That meant that one of our players, Keaton, ended up being in charge of pairings, and I honestly didn't realize that pairings were going on a lot of the time. They just kind of told me, hey, here's the table that you're playing at. You're playing against that guy. Good luck. I believe in you. But for a quick overview of the roster that we ended up bringing, Gonzalez Omar was Victor Campos, who was playing with me for CTC. He was playing Packbone Zealots, Chaos Space Marines with, I believe it was only 2 Defilers, but playing the Abaddon Castle, the full rerolls, Hellbird, so you get the crits on 5s, ended up being very, very gross. We had me, I was playing Recon Guard. I'll go over my list in a moment. We had the original Omar Gonzalez. He was playing a very stock standard Ultramarines Blade of Ultramar list. Then we had Omar Blanco Gonzalez as Keaton, and he was playing Orcs. Last time you probably saw him, he was playing Admech for my team when we went to the West Coast Warbands. But this time he was playing a very stable Warhorde Orcs. It wasn't meant to go win games, it was just meant to end up playing some relatively close games. And then Solid Snape, Omar McFrenzy, aka Jason McKenzie, one of the best Retaliation Cadre players in the world, was naturally playing Retaliation Cadre. Basically, one of the big things that Keaton had going into this was we didn't actually fill out a matrix at all, but he was pretty confident that between me and Jason, we were probably going to come back with 2 medium to large wins, and then the rest of the team just needed to play relatively stable games, come back with somewhere between an 8 and 12, and then once you're there, we should be able to comfortably beat basically every other team at this event. So with that, let's go ahead and get into the list that I ended up bringing to this one. So a little bit of context, we were not playing with the new detachments. We did not have Yarick legal for this event. We did not have any of the new data sheets available. And so when I was talking to Nemo, who I have helped me out with a lot of my recon lists, I basically said, hey, I'm going to probably be first attacking into Tau, first attacking into PBZ guns. I need something that can play recon on open boards where I don't necessarily need to be as good into shooting matchups, but I need to be really, really good at making sure I can beat, or I don't need to be as good at beating melee matchups, but I need to be really, really good at beating a lot of these shooting matchups. So what I ended up playing is I had 3 Cadian Castellans, 3 Cadian Command Squads, all here, Gaunt's Ghost, 3 Ogryn Bodyguards, all with just maximum damage. The Ripper gun is basically heavy bolter, and then the huge knife for the 6 attacks at 812, and then Ursula Creed. Ursula Creed, I did not think was very necessary in this list, especially if I'm going to be playing up against mostly shooting armies, because the CP economy in this army in shooting matchups is really, really easy, but the CP economy in this army up against melee matchups is a lot harder. So I didn't think this was quite as necessary in retrospect. But if you're not used to budgeting your CP quite a bit, it can be very, very expensive. I had 3 units of Cadian shock troops, so that did mean that Ursula Creed is running around by herself. I did not find her particularly relevant. She ended up spending a lot of time hanging out on my home objective, which was fine, but not necessarily what you would necessarily want to be spending 85 points on. I had 1 unit of 20 Catachan jungle fighters, 1, 2, 3, 4 units of 10 Death Corps of Krieg, 2 units of 10 Attilan Rough Riders, 1 unit of 5 Death Riders. This was also a unit that I found a little bit awkward to play on Games Workshop terrain. Then I had 3 units of Krieg Combat Engineers. These help out quite a bit in matchups like Tau or Pac-Man Zealots, or anything where you're expecting to have to deal with like one really big unit, say a Land Raider or Magnus, or something that just has the toughness 10 or higher, 2-up save, 4-up invul, that the rest of the army kind of struggles to deal with. Just making sure you have those mortal wounds ends up being a really nice addition to the list. Lastly, Ratlings showed up in the list. Not a unit I play very often, but you know, they're cute. They help out quite a bit when dealing with the kinds of jails that Montcalm can end up putting on the game. And lastly, a single Scout Sentinel with a las cannon and hunter killer. This is mostly just here. It's 2 things. One, if you need like point and click damage, giving those reroll ones does help out the consistency quite a bit with the army when you're going to be shooting. And then the other thing, of course, is it denies bring it down redraws for free from your opponent. For our first round, we ended up playing up against the Dicehammer Rerollers, or rebranded to the Dicehammer Omars. And I'll be honest, I have no idea how the pairings went for this round, but I ended up playing up against Tom West, and I ended up playing against him on Games Workshop Layout 6. He was playing Ultramarines Blade of Ultramar with a Judiciar with Student of the Codex. I do not know what this is. Lieutenant with Combi Weapon, Marius Calgar, 1 unit of Intercessors, 1 unit of 5 JPI, 1 unit of 6 Blade Guards, 2 Gladiator Lancers, 1 Gladiator Reaper, 1 Infiltrator Squad, 1 Land Raider Redeemer, 1 Scout Squad, 1 Sternguard Squad, 1 unit of 6 Victrix, and the Wardens of Ultramar. Tom was a cool dude, but for this game in particular, he was in way over his head. To kind of put into context some of the issues that Tom ended up having in this game, I would really recommend that people go check out the game that Folger Piles played against. I don't remember his name, but it was up against Blood Angels at Adepticon. And in that game, one of the major things that happened was the Blood Angels player, I think it was actually also on Layout 6, but the Blood Angels player had a Land Raider Redeemer hanging out somewhere back here. And everybody in the comments, everybody in the chat, everybody who was watching was just like, why is this Land Raider Redeemer not hanging out here where you can activate it 10 times? You're going to try and shoot it every time on your turn. You're going to try and overwatch every time with it on your opponent's turn. And then that is going to drastically reduce the number of infantry on the board. Tom also had his Land Raider back here almost the entire game. And I think this game was a really good example of if you don't know what to do against an opponent, you're probably supposed to play more aggressively than you're expecting. I don't feel like I did anything really special in this game other than just take my army and throw it at Tom and make it his problem. With the 2 Gladiator Lancers, they ended up putting in reserves, and the Land Raider Redeemer and with the Land Raider Redeemer playing pretty far back, I was just kind of able to take a unit here, just go. I brought in a unit over here, they just kind of went. I had a unit start here, move here, and then just kind of come this way. And I ended up taking Tom off of his home in turns 3 and 4. On a mission where you're generally expecting to score somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 to 40 primary, Tom ended up scoring only 10 because I had complete control of this. I ended up burning this on turn 3, I think it was. And then I was threatening to burn his home almost every single time by just putting there was like 40, 50 dudes just hanging out up here relatively early on in the game. And a lot of the pieces in Tom's army, so he had like the Wardens of Ultramar back here. He had like the Land Raider here with Marnius, Calgar, and friends. The Blade Guard ended up hanging out over here, but they end up like reactive moving, charging dudes, and going back behind the wall. And I just spent several turns taking like Ratlings coming out, shooting one guy, hanging out on the objective. And I took like Krieg Engineers, and they stood on the objective. And then I took a unit of Death Corps of Krieg, and they stood on the objective. And then eventually I took the unit that was here, came out here, killed like half of the Blade Guard veterans, but there was really just like no counter pressure coming out on the board, and so I was very comfortably able to just take control of almost everything right off the bat. Because my opponent never really put any pressure on me in this game, I was able to completely dictate how the game was going to be played. And it meant that I had significant control over his ability to score primary and his ability to score secondary. And I ended up winning this one 100-41, where Tom was not even able to get a burn off at the end, despite probably having more than 1,000 points of his army still alive. This round overall was not close. And this is honestly probably the single biggest team's win I've ever been a part of. We ended up winning this one 98-2. Everyone on my team ended up getting a 20, except for the original Omars Gonzalez, who only got an 18. I ended up talking to several other players after the round was over when we went to lunch, and the player who was doing the pairings for them was like, hey, was there anything different that I could have done in this? And I kind of felt bad because it's like, on the one hand, like, you probably can target the orcs. The orcs is probably the weakest list that we've brought. But to be entirely honest, this is definitely just a matchup where my team had stronger players. But I had a good time, and I hope the other team had a good time as well. With that out of the way, we end up going into round 2. And I do want to give a bit of a different recap for this game, because the game didn't really happen. Instead, I'm going to have a bit of a talk about like the culture of 40k and ways to think about it and how to potentially get better at 40k in general. One of the most important parts of playing 40k, particularly at a high level, but generally just playing 40k in general, is understanding play by intent. 40k is a little bit different from other games like trading card games like Magic the Gathering, in that it is a perfect information game. In Magic the Gathering, there's a lot of stuff you don't know. There are cards face down, there are cards that are in your opponent's hand, you don't know what is necessarily in your opponent's deck, depending on what format you're playing. And there's a lot of what we would generally call in the Warhammer community gotcha plays. And the other really big thing about 40k is because we are humans, we are naturally very imprecise. We are trying to measure things with sticks and rulers. We are naturally going to be in a spot where it's like, I don't know. I might be moving 6 inches, but realistically, that could be anywhere between 5.5 and 6.5 inches. I'm going to do my best to keep it within like, a quarter inch realistically, but I'm simply a person. I am not that precise of a being. So if you are interested, I would really recommend checking out a video by Sam Pope where he talks about playing by intent and prompted intent and implied intent. And the reason why I'm having this conversation is because my second game didn't really get played at all. As somebody who's used to playing by intent for basically all of my games, there was an interaction or two where I was having with my opponent where I was doing things that he felt were not fair, or because his impression before the game was that being good at 40k was about being millimeter precise, as well as making sure you have every single sequencing part of it down and being really aggressively pre-measuring with all of the different pieces. But they are not what the best players in this game have decided are what matters when it comes to being a good Warhammer player. Unfortunately, my opponent didn't really vibe with this and kind of shut down, and I started talking to him in Battle Round 2, saying, hey man, I can tell you're not having a good time. Can we have a conversation about this? Because I can tell you're not having a good time, I'm not having a good time, and frankly, I'd rather concede the game than have to play the next 2 hours in this environment. We ended up having a discussion about play by intent, what it generally means to be good at Warhammer, and all these kinds of things. But I was legitimately prepared to just concede the game because I was not having a good time at all. We ended up having a judge come over in order to help adjudicate what ended up happening. We agreed to a draw, but we only played like a battle round and a half. While I do think that I was very likely to win that game, I also knew that my team was very likely to win, and the result of the game was not particularly important to me. I told my team what happened relatively early on. They knew that we had adjudicated a draw before anything really actually happened, and then my team ended up winning the round very convincingly. I would strongly recommend anybody who's watching this, one, playing by intent is really important in the 40k community. The game ends up being very unfun for both sides if that is not the expectation going in. It's written into a lot of player packs, and if you're kind of confused on what this means, I would generally strongly recommend going to check out Sam Pope's video. I believe you can find it simply by searching Sam Pope 40k Intent. Back into the normal after action report. For my third round, we ended up playing up against SoCal Gas, and I ended up playing up against Joseph and his Adeptus Sororitas Army of Faith. Going into this one, SoCal Gas was one of the two teams that we thought might actually be potential teams that we were going to struggle with a little bit. Partly, they had a couple players who were above average for this event, but the other major thing is they had a lot of small changes and like list decisions that made them a lot better at dealing with a couple of hordes. And our armies included Recon Guard and Warhorde Orcs with at least 2, maybe 3 bricks of at least 20 guys. And having a couple of those armies that are better at hunting these suddenly changes some of our armies that are very good at creating small wins. And these tech pieces meant that it was a lot harder for us to, one, understand how to play against them, but also just how to like pair well. This was probably the round that we were most uncomfortable with our just armies lined up against their armies. I ended up playing up against Joe and his Army of Faith, and it had a couple of things that I thought were a little bit surprising. So Army of Faith does get to use 2 miracle dice per unit per phase, and it has a lot of ways to generate a couple of extra miracle dice. But in the list is a Canonist with jump pack with an enhancement. I'm not sure what the enhancement does. A Dialogus, 1 Ministorian Priest, Morven Vol, 2 Immolators, both with multi-meltas, 3 Castigators, 2 of them had the auto cannons, and 1 of them had the battle cannon, 1 unit of Celestian Insidiants, which is one of the new kill teams, which they're like reasonably choppy, 2 units of 10 Dominions split into 2 units with the Immolators, 1 unit of Paragon Warsuits, and one of the big things that I did not notice before getting into the game, my opponent told me about it as we were doing things, was instead of the multi-melta, the Paragon Warsuits all had heavy bolters. Then there was a Retributor squad, 2 Seraphim squads with extra hand flamers, and a Zephyrim squad that, attached to the Canonist jump pack, is going to be able to chop up things really, really good and also have the up-down. This game was perhaps one of the most teams games I've played in a long time. My opponent decided basically immediately before they even got to the table that this was not a game that he thought that he could win. Instead, what he wanted to do was he wanted to make sure that he was going to be scoring some points. And so during deployment, he ended up putting like an Immolator. And so during deployment, he started like an Immolator here, like Morven Vol and the Paragon Warsuits are like here, Castigator back here. I think the second Immolator was like here, and then like other Castigator. And this is a very conservative deployment. For my part, when I started seeing that my opponent was doing this kind of deployment, I knew I was like, well, I can't lose this game, right? My opponent is too far back. He is really, really deployed to go second in this game. So if he ends up going first, I can maybe blow him out, because he's going to have to come interact with me relatively quickly, and if he interacts with me, I probably just kill him. But I ended up going first. And one of the big things about this board, because we ended up being on Tipping Point Layout 6 playing Linchpin, is that you can't stand on here safely at all. And the other really big thing is that I don't really have long-range guns in this army, and these are just wide open sides. And so when Joe ended up putting like a bunch of shots, like able to go down here, this Castigator ended up like hanging out like right about here for most of the game, such that it could shoot here. I basically just had to rapid ingress at him in the open. But the game mostly came down to, I held this and this every single turn, and my goal was to try and stop him from holding this basically every turn that I could. And I stopped him from holding this every single turn except for the last one. But my big thing about this was perhaps a little bit of unfamiliarity with the matchup. With my opponent having a couple of different tools in his belt that were a little bit better teched in order to deal with recon, like the Seraphim with the hand flamers, the triple Castigator, the Volgons with heavy bolters, I felt rather uncomfortable just shoving at my opponent. And I think there was a moment in this game where I had an opportunity to make a decision about what it is that I wanted to do with this game. Because the game ended up very quickly being a spot where I just took like basically everything on the board over here, except for like this objective, because I didn't really want to stand on it, was mine. I had like a unit of Catachan that hung out here for several turns. I controlled this objective very easily. I had a bunch of dudes like hanging out in here, and like I think there was a little bit in here, such that I was always going to be able to run over here and deny the objective. But I did have a brick of the Castellan and a bunch of dudes hanging out in reserve, and in the top of 3, I had an opportunity to just take them and go here. I think there were like a couple of girls hanging out tucked in really safely here, and more or less what happened was that if I came in, I was only going to shoot like I think it was like 2 or 3 guys were going to be able to see the girls on this objective. And so they basically would have to come in here and then try and make a charge. And that's more or less all they would end up doing. And the decision that I had was, do I want to bring this here, try and force more diff? I'm almost never going to lose this game, but I did think that trying to play for this was going to open up the opportunity that I come back with less than, less than a 12. I could come back with a draw. And this is something that I'm still like mentally wrestling with, trying to figure out if I'm supposed to do this. So one of the things that ended up happening around this time was I went to go ask some of my teammates like how things were going. And it turns out we had 2 games starting to swing downwards, but we had 1 game swing up sharply. So with 1 game trending a little bit downwards, another game trending medium downwards, but 1 game trending significantly upwards, I ended up deciding to take a line that was not going to jeopardize our ability to win the round. So I ended up playing this game very, very cautiously, very, very slow overall. And with my opponent giving a ton of ground, it ended up being with my opponent just giving a ton of ground on the board for free, I ended up coming out with a 13-7. Do I think this was the most interesting game? No. But I did think it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed playing up against Joe. And I think this game is a really good highlight of how teams generally works. My opponent did not think that he could win, and he thought that interacting with me would lead to him getting less points. So he decided, I'm going to deploy to go second. I'm going to deploy in such a way that I am just going to shoot way better than my opponent at long range. My opponent will never be able to kill me, and I will always be able to score some points in the latter half of the game. And then I do think my opponent was very much rewarded by the fact that they did go second. I ended up going first, which meant that I could have an opportunity to push, but I think if my opponent had been the one who ended up going first, he was really kind of out of position with a lot of his assets where he would never be able to get me off of some of the places that I wanted to be. Like I said, this one ended up being a 13-7, and the team ended up doing just fine. Our first one, our Orcs player into Eldar, we knew this was not a great matchup, so we were very happy when we ended up walking away from this table with an 8. Our Chaos Space Marines said that he wanted this matchup. They were both playing Packbound Zealots, and our opponent's Packbound Zealots had the Huron and the Masters of Maelstrom, and ours did not, so we were very confident that on one of the open boards, we would just outshoot them and kill them that way. My game ended up coming back with, a smallish win. And then this one, it was Retaliation Cadre versus Montcaw, and the Montcaw player went first, having lost a defender roll-off, and the Montcaw player then has to just force the issue right away and turn it into a dice game. But it's a dice game that the Retaliation Cadre player has better tools in because the plus strength and the plus AP ends up lining up really, really nicely. And then lastly, our fearless captain Omar ended up losing a Repex to 3 Dark Lances, not 3 Scourge units with Dark Lances, 1 unit of Scourges with 3 Dark Lances, and then 1 unit of Reavers with their Meltas. He lost the entire Repex through smoke. So this one ended up trending downwards from where we were expecting it to be. But overall, we ended up walking out of this one with a 60-40. And I think the big thing here is just kind of trusting the process overall, knowing that we can take 3 close-ish games as long as we have at least one of our players who's going to come back with one of these big wins. And I think Joe did a really good job here deciding not to push the game and not turn the thing into a dice game where it wasn't necessarily going to be in his favor, because we had 4 relatively close games and one that was more or less a coin flip that we were kind of expecting was going to be a coin flip going into it in the first place, and our player just ended up coming out on top of the coin flip. And that led us to our last round of the event. It was only 4 rounds, which is not that uncommon for teams events these days. And I ended up playing up against Celeste and her Tau, and Celeste is another advisor for Team USA, just like I am. Now, Celeste is not normally a Tau player. Typically, I have seen her play most commonly on Marines, but they had another player on Marines that didn't really have another army to switch to. And so Celeste just wanted to play that she thought she could pilot pretty confidently. And she ended up playing with the Tau Montcaw. Celeste had an Ethereal with the +1 OC enhancement, a Kroot Warshaper for the free stratagems and the Scout enhancement, Twin Lands, 1 unit of 3 broadsides with all the missiles, 1 Ghost Keel, 1 unit of 10 Kroot Carnivores, 1 unit of Kroot Hounds, 1, 2, 3 units of Pathfinders, 3 Riptides, 1, 2 units of Stealth Suits, and 1 unit of Vespid. This round was the only round that I had any real say in pairings at all. And basically what happened was after the first set of pairings went through, I talked to the guy who was doing pairings for us. I talked to Keaton and said, and I said to Keaton, the only way I think we lose this round is if I end up having to play up against Emperor's Children. Not because it's a losing matchup, but rather because it is a volatile one. So let's second defend me. They attacked me with Tau, and I said, hey, I'm going to take Tau to the densest of the remaining boards, which was layout 1. Recon versus Tau is definitely a matchup that, in theory, sounds like it should be very Tau favorite, but it really, really isn't. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, the first thing that you think of is ignores cover. Because there's a lot of ignores cover. You have the marker lights everywhere. You have the ability to do a lot of shooting that completely strips away the recon army rule, which is basically having cover and double cover. However, this doesn't matter as much as you might think. And the reason this doesn't matter as much is because the volume is kind of not there. So even if you have a Riptide where almost every attack is going to kill a guardsman, you only have 6 shots on the main gun, you have 4 shots of missiles that are hitting on 4s if they're guided, and then you have 3 SMS shots for a total of 13. So if you perfectly convert with a Riptide, you're going to be killing 13 guardsmen, but realistically, you're probably going to be killing like 7 or 8. And that kind of comes to the second thing, which is volume is squishy. So a couple of the units that have some of the best volume in the Tau are things like Breachers and Pathfinders. But the issue with these units are they're relatively short-ranged, and they're toughness 3. So whenever you take Breachers or Pathfinders, they come out to try and kill some guardsmen, they die. So your Pathfinders and your Breachers, which are some of your best volume in the army, they only get to go out once. And when your Breachers or Pathfinders are going to trade, and they don't necessarily even always kill a unit of 10 guardsmen, and then they die immediately back, you end up running out of the volume very, very quickly. And having played variations of this matchup a decent amount, and Celeste actually being a friend of Nemo's, who I don't know how many games that they've played up against each other, but definitely has seen plenty of games of Recon, this is one where we kind of knew how this one was going to go more or less from the beginning. And that was more or less the game was going to feel fairly close for the first 2 or 3 battle rounds. And then turns 4 and 5 was more or less going to be Recon completely uncontested on the board. Because Montcalm would lose the advance and shoot, so they become way easier to pre-measure. They would lose the lethals, which was not the most important thing, but does help out with the volume a little bit. And Recon was just going to use all of the 10-man units, all of the relatively small bricks in order to trade really aggressively for some of these smaller units, and then leave only the units that didn't have any volume left at the very end of the game. So Celeste ended up going first and actually had a decent opportunity to create a little bit of space. They put like a unit of Pathfinders just here, such that all of my guys that were here were not going to be able to make it over to the objective at all. And then one of the units of Pathfinders that had started like here ended up going over here, eating Overwatch from a bunch of Catachan that were here. And overall, this Catachan unit, from a little bit of shooting this way and the Pathfinders here, it was brought down to 10 out of 20 guys. But a couple of major things happened right off the bat from this. One, we knew Celeste was going first, which meant a couple of things. That's an entire turn of Montcalm that you basically lose because really still don't get to advance and shoot a whole lot on turn 1. Like I mentioned, I lost 10 Catachan and maybe 1 or 2 other models throughout the course of the rest of my army. And 2, I was going to get the guaranteed 15 at the end. I think realistically, I probably made only one big mistake in this game, where I started off with a unit of 20 dudes hanging out more or less back here, another unit of 20 dudes hanging out more or less in here. And one of the big things is that Celeste was playing the broadsides in this pocket at varying points, either behind the footprint versus in the footprint. They end up shooting off things on the middle objective a couple of times. But one of the big things about this broadside unit is it moves slow. It moves 5 and you can auto advance at 6. And so what that means with the broadsides is if you do go for the auto advance or just risk it, starting from over here, you can at best get to somewhere in here, right? You can only really get to about this spot. Maybe there's a way to get here that's a little bit more generous. I'm not sure exactly what the measurement is. But regardless, no matter where it is, even if we go from the most generous spot here, the generous spot still leaves a pocket on the objective here where I can safely put guys. And so that meant that this 20-man here could come out a little bit earlier instead of this objective where it was not going to die to the Riptide that was here and like a second Riptide that was over here. Like I said, each of them probably going to kill like 7 dudes. And 7 plus 7, as we all know, is going to be less than 20. And so I think I ended up losing a diff point there. I do also think, though, that Celeste got relatively unlucky in turns 4 and 5 and basically didn't draw any scoreable cards for the last 2 battle rounds. But towards the end of the game, it still ended up with a brick hanging out over here, a brick that pushed up into the middle of the board, and a brick that was on this objective. So I was going to get a 15 on both turns 4 and 5, which would really make up for the fact that I was not scoring a ton of primary at the very beginning. This one ended up being a 16-4 in my favor, which both my opponent and I knew was fairly reasonable in terms of where we expected this one to be going back and forth. It's definitely a very recon favored matchup, especially if it's not going to be on some of the most open boards that we were playing. And this round we won overall 73-27. We won 4 of our 5 boards, and the one board we lost was still a 9-11. Very crucially, one of the things that we ended up identifying in this pairings process was that we wanted to first defend our orcs, because we were playing on Games Workshop 1, 2, 4, 6, and 8, and only 1 and 8 are boards that are reasonably playable for a lot of melee armies. And so we made sure that we got our orcs onto a relatively dense board, and then left all of the armies that were good on shooting boards to have those shooting boards available later. And so we managed to get our orcs on our best board and our guard on one of their Tau's weakest boards of the ones that were left. And that meant that our double rep X's, our Tau, and our Pact Bound Zealots CSM all were on very, very open boards where they had very natural advantages based on the way that the terrain was set up. Because of that, overall, we ended up getting first at this event. And along the way, we beat both the second and the third place teams. So we were very happy with it overall. For me, I thought that there was some really valuable reps that I got here with Recon overall, and I got to see a bunch of my friends, so it was a really good time there. I have another event coming up this weekend where I will also be playing Recon at another 5-man team event at Throwdown at the Campground in Covington, Washington. And this is all leading up towards our preparation to go towards the Wyoming Team Championships in a couple of weeks. For now, though, this is going to be a relatively short video. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you guys learned a lot from some of the things that I've said in here. I know we kind of breezed through the games, but I still hope it was useful. Thank you guys so much for watching. We'll see you guys all next time. Bye-bye.